Welcome back to The Critique. This material explores the profound evolution of Greek thought on the divine, arguing that ancient philosophy led not to atheism, but to a subtle, sustained transformation that neutralized the god's practical authority.
Yeah, and the argument is just rock solid. Incredibly well researched, the author really captures this sophisticated intellectual history, and the nuance between ancient restraint and, modern negation is fantastic.
It really is.
But let's dive right into the opening, because that first section is so powerful. We need to make sure the argument just capitalizes on that energy immediately.
Okay, so you're talking about the existential hook?
It kicks off with that big question. What if disbelief was not rebellion, but responsibility? Exactly. And it pulls you into these questions of meaning and justice. How do you stand upright without divine support? It's a great start.
So what's the issue?
Well, the material establishes a really compelling and original premise, but the transition from that philosophical setup to the concrete historical evidence, the Quiet Revolution, it could be accelerated to really reinforce the central thesis.
I can see that, but don't you think spending some time on that high-level setup serves a purpose? I mean, it makes an ancient dilemma feel very immediate, very relevant to us now.
It does serve a purpose, but I think the current flow spends just a moment too long on the abstract idea of standing upright before it grounds the unique historical observation.
Okay.
The weakness there is at the slight delay. It risks separating the philosophical tension from the really specific, urgent historical move the Greeks actually made.
Which was?
Which was opting for explanation, for political theory, over just simple denial. The reader needs to know, fast, that this isn't just about doubt. It's about replacement.
I see. Okay. So if the core argument is about transformation, about neutralization, we need to bring those mechanics of neutralization right to the foreground. Much faster.
Precisely. Integrate the most radical early historical outcomes more quickly into that introduction. It immediately grounds the tension between, thought becoming brave and the actual intellectual tools the Greeks used to get there.
Can you give a concrete example? How do you make that pivot sharp?
Sure. Right after posing those initial what-if questions, bring in the sophist idea that religion is a political invention.
That it's designed to restrain human violence.
Yes. That move immediately connects the philosophical question of responsibility, that's the individual choice, to the historical mechanism of social control. It shows the reader this isn't just about whether gods exist, it's about explaining their origin and their function in purely human terms.
Which is a far more devastating critique.
It is. It's a complete reframing. So instead of waiting for philosophy to slowly erode belief, you show the reader that the Greeks already had the tools to functionally dismantle religion as a civic institution.
Right.
Or alternatively, you could just make the observation that the gods became objects of explanation, the immediate follow-up to the opening questions. That establishes right away that belief was no longer inevitable. It was optional.
And that would sharpen the focus from this kind of generalized doubt to the specific form of Greek intellectual resistance.
Exactly. It pulls the existential hook directly into the historical thesis, tightens the whole opening up dramatically.
Okay, let's move on. The structural core of the piece, this is where it really gets into the systematic removal of divine authority through philosophy. It makes a strong case for dissolution, not denial, by analyzing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We see, Socrates' daimonion moving the divine into individual conscience.
Right.
Plato's gods becoming principles rather than persons, and then Aristotle's unmoved mover being, indifferent and unusable.
That section has all the necessary data points, for sure. But to maximize the force of that central thesis, that the strategy was dissolution, the structural connections between those examples need to explicitly emphasize the systematic removal of divine function.
So the reader knows the three figures are connected, but you're saying the essay needs to actively narrate how they collaborate, even if it's unintentional, in that deconstruction.
Yes, exactly. The weakness is that the analysis of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it risks presenting their contributions as these discrete, separate theological innovations.
Instead of stages in a process.
Instead of stages in a unified, erosive process where the divine gradually loses its practical content, its utility, in ritual, in governance, in intervention. They sort of appear as separate trees, not as parts of a forest being cleared.
The writer has all the pieces there. They describe how belief was stripped of its complacency, but the pieces aren't labeled as part of a single continuous machine. So how can the writer make that pattern of functional collapse totally unmistakable?
By strengthening the transitional language between these key figures, you have to explicitly articulate how each thinker stripped the gods of a necessary political or social or personal utility. That's what reinforces the overall pattern.
So the key isn't just what they believed about the gods. It's about what the gods could no longer do after their revisions. Is that the concept we need to drive home?
That is precisely the concept. The structure should actively narrate the sequence of losses. So think of it this way. What functional tool did Plato remove that Socrates hadn't already touched?
Well, Socrates internalized the divine. He challenged its external public authority.
Right. He destabilized the civic gods. So when we transition to Plato, the essay needs to be crystal clear about the net functional effect of his contribution.
Give us a concrete example of that transition.
Okay, so when moving from the Socratic daimonion to Plato's reconstruction, you could use a transition that summarizes the net effect. Something like, if Socrates destabilized the civic gods, Plato preserved the idea of belief by transforming it into metaphysical principles.
Okay.
And this is the key, in doing so, he removed the moral contradictions, the crude human passions, and he inadvertently made the gods philosophically sound but emotionally distant.
And practically inert for, daily worship.
Exactly. The gods became too refined to actually intervene.
That framing makes the erosion cumulative. I like that. So what about Aristotle? Where does he fit in that sequence of functional loss?
That's the third critical blow. When you introduce Aristotle's unmoved mover, you have to state explicitly that this step makes the gods not merely distant, but completely inert. They're self-absorbed, pure thought, and critically,
They could not anchor ritual, inspire fear, or guarantee order.
precisely. You have to emphasize that this removal of practical content, the inability to perform a job in the human realm, is the key link connecting these figures. It shows a unified, though maybe unintended, progression toward total irrelevance. That unified narrative just elevates the structural force of the entire piece.
That's an incredibly clear structural recommendation. So we move from functional criticism with the sophists to functional internalization with Socrates,
To functional refinement with Plato.
and finally to functional irrelevance with Aristotle. It creates this cohesive single argument across that whole middle section.
And it ensures the reader sees a continuity of the intellectual attack, rather than just a sequence of separate philosophical schools.
Okay, let's turn to the material significance then. The final sections have this compelling framework for understanding that psychological shift from dependence to autonomy,
Right.
and it highlights the ancient preference for restraint, dissolving religion into philosophy instead of just outright negation, which created a cultural space for ambiguity.
This is where the material really achieves its highest relevance, I think, linking this ancient restraint directly to the character of modern disbelief that could further amplify the impact.
The material does note that antiquity tolerated ambiguity. It left that final, explicit step of denial to later centuries. It calls this the delayed expression. What's the weakness there?
I think the full significance of this specific ancient restraint, this refusal to rush in and fill the void, is just a little understated when you contrast it with, say, the later development of militant atheism.
Okay.
The writer implies it, but doesn't fully articulate why that restraint was a better, or maybe even more courageous, philosophical path. We need to elevate the so what of this quiet revolution.
Right, so the argument as I see it is that the ancient approach prioritized depth without dependence, finding transcendence in nature or reason without needing a personal god to sign off on it. How can the writer make that contrast with modern negation more explicit, without, drifting into a whole other history lesson?
You frame the ancient refusal to say there is no God as a profound philosophical choice, a choice to avoid replacing one certainty with another. We need to dedicate some space to contrasting the ancient strategy of preserving that space for ambiguity with the character of later, more aggressive forms of secularization.
So we're contrasting the mode of disbelief, essentially,
The ancient mode versus the modern polemic.
Exactly. The weakness is solved by clarifying that contrast. We need to focus on the material's assertion that ancient philosophy achieves an emancipation of value virtue detached from divine sanction. That's the real core of their restraint.
Give us some concrete, actionable advice here. How do we strengthen that comparison and draw out the modern relevance?
I would suggest expanding the discussion of the silent revolution to explicitly contrast this ancient focus on character and ethical consistency, the ability to act virtuously without a divine threat or reward, with the modern focus on epistemological proof and polemical denial.
I see. The goal of the ancient philosopher was autonomy. They were trying to prove that humans were capable of justice without heaven's guarantee.
That shifts the entire focus. So the ancient legacy isn't simply the groundwork for negation, it's the groundwork for conscious choice, for ethical self-governance. That's the takeaway we have to solidify. Show that the restraint was a moral argument in itself. The ancients understood that affirmation and denial require equal justification, and that prevented them from adopting simple slogans. They weren't trying to prove God's wrong, they were trying to prove humans capable. And that philosophical position, that's the true legacy of restraint. It makes the entire essay incredibly timely.
This has been incredibly insightful, really clear, deep, actionable suggestions. So to recap for the writer, first, accelerate the historical grounding in the intro. Connect that philosophical opening immediately to the concrete sophistic mechanisms of explanation to foreground the core thesis. Second, bolster the structural transitions between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Use that concept of functional collapse to emphasize how each step stripped the gods of a practical utility, so the reader sees it as a continuous, erosive process.
Right.
And finally, explicitly link that ancient restraint, the tolerance for ambiguity, to the material's current relevance by contrasting that choice with modern polemics. That will really maximize the essay's significance.
I am genuinely impressed by the depth of insight here. The material successfully identifies that the true legacy of antiquity isn't atheism, it's intellectual courage. It's the conscious choice to live without leaning on heaven. This is an incredible piece of work, and it's ready to be sharpened into something truly exceptional.
We look forward to seeing the revised version. Send it back in anytime.